I call the Subcommittee of Mining, Tourism, and Forestry to order. Today's date is Wednesday, March 7th. I want to welcome everyone to come out early this morning. Representative Bliss, have you looked over the minutes?
I have, Mr. Chair, and I move that we approve the minutes.
All right. Any changes? All right. All approved?
Aye.
Aye. There we go. Everyone say aye. Thanks. All right. We have the Aggregate Resource Task Force before us this morning. I'll let you guys take it from there. So appreciate your work all throughout the summer in putting this together, and we look forward to hearing the report.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Fred Corrigan. I'm an executive director.
Excuse me. Would you make sure you're in the microphone there as good as you can?
I have a very bad cold, so I'm not
All
sure
right.
how
We forgive
strong
those
I'm gonna
things.
be able to be. Again, can you hear me now?
Not really.
No? I'm not sure we're on. There we go. Thank you. For the record, my name is Fred Corrigan. I'm Executive Director of the Aggregate and Ready Mix Association of Minnesota. Thanks to the committee for its support in appointing the task force to follow up on the 2000 aggregate resources report to the legislature. And thanks to Representative Swedzinski for his leadership as co-chair of the task force, and to subcommittee's members Lewick, Eklund, and Sundin for their service on the task force. Members of our association appreciate the work of the task force and believe the task force met its duties to study aggregate resources across the state and provide recommendations to preserve those resources for future generations and future economic development. Our association and its members participated as stakeholders in the work of the task force and by providing testimony during the meetings of the task force. We also want to recognize the support of the Department of Natural Resources and the Department of Transportation and their assistance in preparing information for the task force. I think one of the things that the two agencies and the members of the committee began to recognize is that Minnesota has been blessed with some of the best aggregates in the country for many years, and those quality aggregates are starting to wear out, if you like. Fewer and fewer sources of those aggregates. The St. Croix Bridge, for instance, almost all of the aggregates came from St. Cloud. And so when you start hauling aggregates 40, 50, 100 miles, the cost goes up exponentially. The cost of the resource is nowhere near as much as the cost of the transportation. So that's sort of what we're facing in the next 20 to 40 years, is some of the best aggregate resources in the state, like Maple Grove, like Apple Valley, will run out in the next decade or earlier. And that pushes, especially in the northern suburbs of the Twin Cities, a source of aggregates really up to Elk River and beyond into Stearns County. The southern metro, a little better with the UMOR project that could be as much as a 40-year supply, depending on the demand. But again, those are some of the best resources, and we need to be careful about making sure that we know where resources are across the state and working to figure out how to use resources that may not be the best, or blending resources to mix the better resources with maybe more marginal resources. We also agree with the task force recommendations on the need to fully map those counties that have not yet been mapped, the value of those maps to ensure the state takes advantage of the remaining resources, and the need to provide local governments the tools and authority to maximize the value of the mapping program. There are about 13 counties that are waiting to be mapped. That means that they have applied to the Department of Natural Resources for mapping and are just waiting for state funding to move those maps along. They should be the first priority, but there are probably 30 more counties beyond that that need to be mapped in the near future. There is, in the report number 2, it talks about doing an audit of the tax provisions that were passed in 2008, and specifically the 15% of the aggregate tax that some counties collect. It's an optional tax. how they're spending those dollars. In the past, before 2008, there was a 10% fund for the reclamation of public aggregate pits. So pits that have been abandoned over the years and had not been reclaimed, those dollars were meant from those. But there was a trigger in that tax that allowed counties to take those dollars after a year, if there had not been a request for those dollars, and put them back in the road fund. And almost 100% of those dollars went back to the road fund. Not to say that that wasn't an good expenditure of those dollars, but the reclamation of those public pits kind of fell behind. So in 2008, on the recommendation of the 2000 task force, there was a recommendation to expand that to not only from 10% to 15% of the tax, but also to expand it to any environmental improvement that was requested by a host community to the county that collects the tax. And that included not just reclamation of public pits that had not been reclaimed, but also private pits in some cases, an issue that had some controversy with our members because that should be part of the permitting process, but also where there might be an environmental advantage, a bike trail, a walking path, or other environmental asset that was in the host community where that mine was looking for a permit. We have agreed with AMC that an audit really isn't probably necessary. A survey of their members would probably accomplish best management practices, and we'll work with the chair and others to see if we can get that survey done over the summer before the 2019 session. Recommendations 4, 5, and 6 really deal with local land use and permitting issues. The testimony from the county planning and zoning officials showed a wide variety of traditional and creative approaches to the zoning and permitting of aggregate resources across the state. We look forward to working with these officials and members of this subcommittee to identify barriers to aggregate resource development and educate and implement effective strategies to ensure that property owners in aggregate areas are aware of the resources and have the opportunity to be involved in its extraction and reclamation to the benefit of the community in the state of Minnesota. We also have seen over the last decade a greater use of IUPs, interim use permits, as opposed to the traditional CUP that went with the land forever. We recognize the value of IUPs. We don't discount that trend, with one exception, that these are long-term projects where some of these resources might take 20, 30, 40 years to fully develop. If we could talk about maybe either applying the CUP to aggregate permits or amending the IUP to recognize the length of time that it would take to actually fully develop those resources. And lastly, the aggregate mining reclamation, the subcommittee talked about some of the challenges in reclamation, and especially those old mines that we continue to be a challenge to be reclaimed. I think one of the things we've seen in the last 20 years in the industry is and working actually with the DNR on a reclamation policy and handbook that they put together, was a policy where you start reclamation with the first shovel in the mine. So you're actually starting to think about the reclamation as you start developing that mine. And that allows you to deal with the overburden once instead of 2 or 3 times. You're not moving dirt from one end of the property to the other end of the property. And we've seen properly planned, that is a very efficient way of reclamation and assures the county that they won't be left with a hole in the ground at the end of the project. And so we think we've made a lot of advancement in that process, but we still have some work to go on pits that still need to be reclaimed. So, Mr. Chair, again, thank you for your hard work on this. We look forward to working with you and the committee on funding for the mapping program this year and some of these other recommendations as we go into 2019.
Thank you very much. Jess?
Yes.
Would you like to introduce yourself for the record? And
Yes, Mr. Chair. Oh, there we go. Mr. Chair, Jess Richards.
Director
I'm the
Richards, yeah.
Director of the Lands and Minerals Division for the Department of Natural Resources. Thank you for the opportunity to come and speak to you today. Normally, when we talk about aggregate, you would probably see Heather Ahrens, who some of you met as we had the task force going this summer. And Heather's out of state and And by the number of emails she has sent me in the last few days, I think she's very worried that I'm going to screw this up, so I'm going to do my best. So you can see in the recommendations from the Aggregate Task Force, as Mr. Corrigan mentioned, a number of fantastic recommendations. We also appreciate the work that the task force has done and valued participating in it. One of the recommendations is about aggregate mapping. If you turn to the back of the report, you can see a map of the counties that have had aggregate mapping. And I'll reference back to this in just a minute, but this is just a look at the different counties where aggregate mapping has occurred from the DNR. We've been conducting aggregate mapping in Minnesota since 1984 at a snail's pace. We used to receive some funding, and so we did some initial work at the beginning, and since then we haven't had funding for aggregate mapping, so we've kind of just been piecing it together with partial FTEs, doing as much as we can. And the purpose of aggregate mapping is really to help protect the resource and inform decision-making. So it helps local governments effectively plan for future supply needs for aggregate, and it also really helps inform their land use decisions, decisions about development, decisions about other types of activities on the landscape. About half of all aggregate consumed in Minnesota is paid for through public tax dollars, and that comes at the local level. It's used for maintaining roads and bridges, infrastructure. Certainly it's used in major construction activities as well. And as Mr. Corrigan mentioned, the trends in hauling seem to indicate that as you get beyond 30 miles from the source, the cost doubles every 30 miles that you go. So it really is a local resource, and it's important to do local mapping in order to help do local planning. The program is directed by Minnesota Statute 84.94 to promote the orderly development of sand and gravel resources to make sure they're not lost to other land use decisions without consideration. And this information that we put together is we put together a mapping system that looks at each county. We go out and we use LIDAR, we look at historic gravel pits, we look at potential areas where there's been aggregate identified before. We go out and do sampling, and through that process we're able to put together a very effective map. We're able to publish it online now for counties that helps the counties be able to use that kind of resource, not only for quantity but quality as well, to make land use decisions. We had some examples in some counties in the past where there hasn't been mapping. And now we find in some of those counties that the absolute highest quality aggregate is covered with a housing development. And I think it would have been important for the county to understand their aggregate resource prior to making decisions on where to locate that development. And so that's the kind of thing that goes on. This aggregate mapping program is on the Minnesota Association of County Planning and Zoning Administrators legislative agenda for 2018. They support it. And, you know, every county is a little bit different, but every county has demand. You know, township roads need aggregate. And while, you know, the biggest demand is clearly in the metro area, there's a scarcity issue in some counties. And so some counties may only have one good source of aggregate. So it's important to do the work to identify those resources for them as well. Let's see, we don't think that in any way the DNR mapping program, it's not meant to supplement some other mapping program or county geologic atlases or anything. It's really complementary to those other efforts that are out there. And unlike metallic mining, land use decisions, aggregate decisions are done at the county level, they're done at the local level. So if you look at this map on the back of the report, you can see that 27 counties have been mapped in the state so far. Aiken County was the last county to get an aggregate map done by us. We have 2 in progress, Candy, Ojai, and Redwood. And we have 61 counties that need aggregate mapping. You can see on here that there's a number that have passed county board resolutions that have requested mapping. Those are in yellow. I think it's 13 there. And there's a number, of course, that again, haven't had the mapping work done. So I guess in summary, I just want to say that the DNR is very supportive of the efforts by the task force and the recommendation to really ramp up the aggregate mapping program. And we believe that with the right amount of resources, we could get the whole state mapped in a 10-year process, doing about 6 counties a year. And with that, I'll take any questions, Mr. Chair.
Director Richards, I appreciate your presentation. I think you did a fine job.
Thank you.
You know, just just kind of some basic questions. So 6, have there been other counties that have been on the list that have passed resolutions, then because of lack of funding have potentially dropped off that list? Some of those.
Mr. Chair,
Director
members,
Richards.
I'm not aware of any additional resolutions that have been passed, but we have spent time talking with the Association of Minnesota Counties about this topic, and there seems to be broad support for the idea of getting this mapping done. I think they recognize that it's a finite resource and it's an important one to their communities.
Thank you, Director Richards. Will you be putting a request in potentially next year as part of the main budget?
Mr. Chair, members, we haven't sorted that out yet. I think we wanted to see what was going to happen this year, and if necessary, then we would pursue something in our budget cycle next year. I think under the Aggregate Task Force recommendation, if there was something that the legislature saw fit to do this year, we could get started, which wouldn't be a bad thing, and then we could come back at the biennial budget to take care of the rest.
Sounds good. Thank you. Representative Lewick.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and just want to speak a little bit to the importance of this. I know Aiken County went through, was one of the last ones to finish that mapping, partly because 60 miles won't get you across the county. So when you start talking about hauling gravel, it's a big deal if you gotta haul it a long distance. Couple questions. One is, what's been the history on LCCMR support for this process? I believe in the past there's been some request for LCCMR funding to support this program. And I believe that would have came from the DNR.
Director Richards.
Mr. Chair, members, and I'll ask Mr. Corrigan to chime in because he may have more history on it than I do, but I believe we have tried on 2 occasions for LCCMR funding, and it hasn't worked out yet. We certainly would be willing to go down that path again if that's where folks would like to go. Do you have any additional?
No, just to reemphasize that there is debate in the LCCMR process about whether this really qualifies for the constitutional definition of LCCMR.
Representative Lewick.
Yes, and you know, we get our hands slapped when the legislature starts tinkering with that process, but I can just say that this is a statewide project. It's intended to look at an existing natural resource, and it certainly would seem like it would match up. So I would more than encourage the DNR to continue to fire in requests for that. And the other side of this coin is we all wring our hands about local property taxes, and we hear about it down here in St. Paul. Well, when you've got a program that works, but it you know, is it fair to go to the property tax payers and jam that on the county, because that's where the heavy lifting goes, even with the DNR support for this mapping. So we can't have it both ways. If we're really serious about a statewide program here and get this across the entire state, then LCCMR probably needs to pony up here. We're going to go back to well, there the legislature goes again. You know, poking into that basket where they're not supposed to. So I know you may or may not have some feelings on that, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Representative Lewick. I don't believe there was a question for the testifiers here, but no, I do believe, you know, when you look at money spent versus money spent when it comes to transportation projects, you know, as we heard in the testimony, that the price of the aggregate goes up dramatically by how many miles it needs to travel. You know, the request, I believe, is $450,000 and then $900 after that. You know, from a county perspective and from a state perspective, the less travel when those roads are being built and those roads are being maintained for that aggregate, you know, I think it will pay for itself. I don't believe this is a true cost. This is a true benefit when it comes to making those wise decisions across the state when it comes to development and actual just resources.
And
Mr. Kerrigan?
I could just add, I think what we're working with the chairs, the co-chairs of the task force is to perhaps look at a general fund appropriation this year to get the program back up and running, and then to spend some time looking at the LCCMR process and make a final decision on whether that's an appropriate source of funding for for this program. I believe, Mr. Richards, that when the program was funded, it was part of the DNR general appropriation, which during the recession was cut back, and this program was one of those casualties.
All right. We have Mrs. Bergquam. You'd come up and take a chair. You'd state your name for the record.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. My name is Jennifer Bergquam. I represent the Association of Minnesota Counties on Environment and Natural Resources issues, and I also represent the Minnesota Association of County Planning and Zoning Administrators, oftentimes called McPizza, if you've heard of that.
Pizza.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to testify today. I can keep my comments brief because Mr. Richards did a very nice job covering how this does impact counties. We very much support the first recommendation, mapping, statewide mapping for aggregates. And we believe this will provide uniform information throughout the state. It will help prioritize land uses at the local level, and it'll help designate and protect areas that have high-value aggregate resources. And as already mentioned, aggregates are important to counties. As far as the other recommendations, we look forward to working with the committee and the task force and the industry on moving forward with how counties can maybe look at best management practices, learn from each other, and try to help move this process along. I think we would just be concerned if any of these items were ever to become mandates, but I think we're just looking forward to continuing the conversation, so thank you.
All right, thank you. Any
Any
questions?
questions? Thank you.
All right,
Mr.
thank
Chair
you.
and committee.
All right, any other questions for the testifiers? Final call? All right. Thank you very much. Appreciate the work, and we look forward to coming up with some hopeful solutions as we move forward. So next up, we have the Sustainable Timber Harvest Analysis Report. Would Director Bowe come on down? If you'd state your name for the record, we'd appreciate that. So.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, members. For the record, my name is Forrest Bowe. I'm the Director of Forestry with Minnesota DNR. And with me today,
Good morning. My name is Luke Skinner. I'm the Director of the Division of Ecological and Water Resources for the DNR. I'm here to help answer questions after the presentation.
Excellent. Welcome to the committee.
thank you, Mr. Chair. I do have a PowerPoint presentation, and I believe you all have copies of the PowerPoint in your packet, too. So today, wanted just to take some time to review with you our sustainable timber harvest analysis. You should have all gotten a copy of that emailed to you, I think Thursday of last week. It was a report that was due to the legislature, and of course, that's what we'll be talking about today. I want to kind of start by saying that I'm not a forest modeler. There's a lot of really intelligent people that spent a ton of time on this, and so my job today is really to give you a very abbreviated overview of 16 months worth of work, an overview of a 350-page analysis that was done by an independent contractor where multiple computers ran for 30 days straight to come up with some of these scenarios. This is just really complex stuff, and you know, sometimes we tend to oversimplify things, and I'm going to try to do that today, but there's a lot of details behind all of this. And of course, even with our own staff, taking that analysis that was done by the contractor and just spending weeks and months poring over that data and pushing the modelers to try different things so that we could analyze this harvest and ultimately come to a decision that balances all of these forest resources. So that's my job in a few minutes to try to boil it all down and so that we can have good conversation and hopefully some questions. So that's where we'll start. So I wanted to set the stage a little bit and talk about, the purpose of our forests, and we are under several statutory requirements. Our forest resources are defined in Minnesota Statutes Chapter 89 as those natural assets, including timber, biological diversity, recreation, fish and wildlife habitat, wilderness, rare and distinctive flora and fauna, air, water, soil, climate, educational, aesthetic, and historic values. That's a lot of stuff that we're required to manage for. Also in Minnesota Statutes Chapter 89, it mandates us to manage forests for multiple use. In 89A, we're mandated that we manage for sustainability. In Minnesota Statutes Chapter 84, it describes our responsibilities as trustees for the school trust lands. And in Minnesota Statutes Chapter 86A, it talks about our responsibility for wildlife management areas. And I throw that in there because some of these forest lands are actually on our wildlife management areas. So that's the statutory stuff that we're dealing with when we think about forest lands. So why do we do a sustainable timber harvest analysis? Well, I think to start out, the governor had been hearing from industry that we should be offering more and more timber. So in essence, I think he really called the question. He called the question and asked us to do the analysis if 1 million cords is sustainable on state lands. Our previous target for probably 15 years or so has been about 800,000 cords, or it has been 800,000 cords of timber offered for sale. And all of this, of course, is based on our forest inventory and, of course, our management practices. So we definitely agreed that it was time to do this again. And in this case, went outside hired an independent firm to do the analysis. And I think everyone would agree, all the people that we've brought into the project, even the stakeholders, thought that independent group really had done a great job. And I'll talk about that quite a bit more here in just a few minutes. Over the period of time from fiscal year 12 to 16, so that 5-year period of time just fairly recently here, our average timber volume offered was 837,000 cords and an average sold of 812,000 cords. And our last significant review of 800,000 cords was in 2008. So again, 10 years ago, and we certainly agree that it was time to do a new analysis. These forests that we manage are changing every day. They are dynamic. They are living things, and thus we need to periodically review what we do and how we do it. We have blowdowns, we have fires, we have insects and diseases affecting many acres on any given year. And we also see the amount of different tree species, and the mix of those tree species in a stand changes over time. So again, just really thinking about, yeah, we need to do this. We need to do this every so often, and it's definitely time. So we looked at this as an opportunity to really find the right harvest level consistent with the state's policies. And to really put this simply, sustainable forest management seeks to balance complex, interrelated goals, including commercial harvest, wildlife habitat, biodiversity, and clean water. And we do that today in a way that doesn't limit future generations' ability to do the same. So that's what we're talking about. I also would be remiss if I didn't say something about the industry and how important it is to our state. You know, Governor Dayton directed us to do this updated analysis to make sure that DNR lands are managed to support the industry and that really vital economic sector while maintaining the other critical forest values. So our forest products industry in the state is still our 5th largest manufacturing industry in Minnesota, and contributes over 64,000 jobs and $17.6 billion worth of annual economic impact. So it is a big deal. We use timber harvesting and reforestation as a tool to help us manage our lands, but it's really not an additional thing. It's really what we do. It's how we manage our forests to provide those diverse habitats and clean water. Without the industry, we would have to pay someone to do the management on our lands. So that's how critical this industry is to us. They purchase our timber. Every stand has its own prescription to meet these multiple values, and industry allows us to do that without us being the state, having to pay for that work done. So it's a very good relationship, we are definitely concerned about the industry and support the industry. Today, I'm going to share a little bit about our sustainable timber harvest analysis. I'm going to talk about the process, a very condensed overview of that 300-page analysis with all the charts and graphs. I know you had access to it, and of course, talk about our decision. But to kind of start things off again, really thinking about the forest land in Minnesota. So we have 17.4 million acres of forest land in Minnesota. The majority of that is privately owned. The department manages 5 million acres of forest land, but only about 2.75 million acres of that is actually commercially harvestable. So, the things that are excluded and not available for harvest are timberlands in state parks, in our scientific and natural areas, the BWCAW, old growth, other areas that are technically forested, but not available for commercial harvest or don't produce enough size and volume for commercial harvest would be like stagnant swamp kinds of forested species. And also areas that are, lowland brush and that kind of thing. So we kind of group a lot of things in the overall definition of forest, but when we boil it down, there's only 2.75 million acres that we manage for commercial forest. All right. This sustainable timber harvest level was based on really a multifaceted approach over 16 months where we carefully weighed input from many sources. And those sources are identified here. Really the objective with all of this is to create an open and transparent process and not do things behind the closed doors. So we formed a project team within the department that included individuals and staff from divisions of forestry, ecological and water resources, and fish and wildlife that guided the project work. We also formed a stakeholder advisory group. It was a 14-member group representing a broad range of interests, including industry, environmental and conservation groups, academia, our federal and county land managers and partners, and all of these groups provided input to help guide the analysis and guide the process. So again, I think we had great representation and folks were very engaged. We had an independent contractor. I talked about this a couple of minutes ago, a group from Oregon, Mason, Bruce, and Gerard. They bid on our project. They were the low bidder, but they were an extremely good group to work with and just did a bang-up job. And I think anyone that had been involved with the project looks at the analysis itself and says they really did good work. We got public comments on the analysis. Over our 45-day public comment period, over 140 people commented on our project. So after all of that, we have determined sustainable timber harvest of 870,000 cords annually is our sustainable number. This sustainable number represents a careful balancing of all of our multiple objectives in managing our forest land, including supporting wildlife, maintaining that clean air and water, providing the recreational opportunities, sustaining our biodiversity, and also providing a reliable source of wood for Minnesota's forest industries. And that's a really important thing. I think to have any kind of a number that fluctuates up and down is not good for industry. We really want to be the steady and reliable source for that industry can count on. This, as you might know by all of the documentation and the report, this was really a decision that was informed by a lot of rigorous science and the stakeholder input, the public comments, and discussions with the Office of School Trust. We relied on them a lot, and they provided a lot of great input and advice in the analysis. In addition to the 870,000 cords, we're also implementing an ash and Tamarack Initiative. We recognize that there may be a short-term opportunity to accelerate some harvesting of ash and tamarack in the state, followed by some reforesting to other species in advance of these deadly pests. This 5-year initiative is expected to result in maybe an additional 30,000 cords annually offered, and we'll certainly reassess after the 5 years. We do recognize that this level of increase would require some substantial growth in the ash and tamarack markets. These are two species that, you know, the industry doesn't use a ton of right now. I think they're starting to adapt and use more of it, which is good. And we're certainly willing and able, in this case, to make sure that that happens. This is really a resource that would otherwise be lost if we didn't take this opportunity. And equally as important, it gives us a chance to make sure that these lands stay productive through our thoughtful reforestation work. So thinking about dying ash, dying tamarack, if you just let it go, it's hard to get that forest to be reforested and grow into the next forest. But if we can come in and harvest it while it's still alive, we can be proactive to reforest those areas.
Thanks, Director. Well, we have a question, Representative Eklund.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Director, you talked about this initiative. The first question is that 30,000, is that in addition to the 870,000 that you set the cut limit, that the DNR set the harvestable cord limit at?
Director Bowe?
Mr. Chair, Representative Eklund, that is in addition to the 870,000 cords.
Thank you.
Representative Eklund?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So my second question on this, and going through this plan and setting this limit, have you consulted with industry about current use and whether there will actually be a market for that, or are we going to try to develop a new market for this ash and tamarack?
Director Bowe?
Mr. Chair, Representative Eklund, we consult with industry very frequently, and that's why I think they've seen some uptick in, we've seen some uptick in ash utilization. We talked with them a couple of years ago. We've got ash. We want to get ahead of this. Excuse me. And some of our mills have been receptive, so we've seen an increase. And so we're constantly working with them, and we'd certainly like to develop some new markets as well for species that, you know, don't have a good, strong market today.
Representative Eklund, follow-up? Representative Metsa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Mr. Bowe, thank you for the presentation today and update. My question's more along the lines of we've invested as a state and locally in our region in projects like Sweetwater and Mountain Iron, Louisiana Pacific. If those come to fruition, I know we've been working on also finding additional private land to harvest and working better there with additional staff to get that done. But do you see 900,000 now combined as enough to sustain two new larger consumers in the marketplace?
Director Bowe?
Mr. Chair, Representative Metsa, there's always changes and shifts in the market when a new mill comes on, or unfortunately if one leaves, and so that supply is always moving around. In many cases, we get, imports from Wisconsin and Canada that help out with that. We've certainly got the PFM thing at least up and running and making good progress there. So that's providing more Minnesota fiber as well. The companies that you have mentioned each do their own analysis to make sure that they're not going to invest in a state that doesn't have an ample supply. And that's why it's important that the state of Minnesota be that steady supplier. No matter who is here, what company is here, we want to be that steady supplier so that whatever company is here can count on that. We know that paper is, things are happening with our paper companies, and everyone's got something in their pocket that they're talking on or taking notes on rather than using paper. And I think for Minnesota, we want to make sure we do no harm to our existing industry, but we also have open arms to the next industry that might come in to utilize some of these resources.
Director Bowe, I think if you would have came here with that 360-page report for each member, that might have helped a little bit, but Representative Message is teasing. But
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I guess it does sound like if some of these projects come to fruition, they get going, that we'd be willing to explore potentially looking at the 900,000 number and whether it was adequate and moving that up. I know we've met with Assistant Commissioner Meyer already, and I think we'd like to see the number go up around 100,000 from where it is now, and we'll continue to work with you in that regard.
Representative Heinzman?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Director Bowe, I just had to peek ahead in your presentation, and I was looking for a discussion on the mountain pine beetle. I see here we're looking at the eastern beetle and the emerald ash borer, but as the mountain beetle makes its way through Canada, I think that's the suspected route or expected route. I'm sure you're thinking about it, but what are we doing to make sure that forests are healthy? Because it's likely at some point we'll be dealing with that, and a young forest seems to do much better than an old growth forest. Where are we at?
Director Bowe, if you're going to get to that later in your presentation, we can save it, but if you want to address that now, you can.
Mr. Chair, Representative Heisman, I wasn't going to actually talk in detail about that later, so maybe I can address it really quickly now. And Representative Heisman, you are right in that we don't have the mountain pine beetle here in Minnesota yet. We have, we have a quarantine on imports from those areas that have mountain pine beetle to make sure that we try to slow it down, and something could happen any day. So we're doing the best we can there. And you're also right in that we see the mountain pine beetle coming across Canada and will probably enter Minnesota via that route. It is a devastating pest. It's going to enjoy and like our red pine and our jack pine. It will do very well with those species, so we're very concerned about that. And we do know that there are some harvest techniques that can slow down that pest before it gets here, and also once it does get here. So we're certainly concerned about that, and we're continuing to work with the University of Minnesota and studying that and figuring out what we can do. But we certainly want to be proactive with the mountain pine beetle as best we can.
Representative Heinzman, follow-up?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, I would encourage your department to look closely at that 87 number, and I know that we're trying to maintain a sustainable harvest, but it may be that because of this threat specifically in our pine forests, that we may need to consider making adjustments and increasing harvest levels to make sure that we're prepared. It may take 10 years to be ready for this impact, and hopefully it never comes, but I think the odds of it being here are significant enough that it should be a part of our analysis.
All right, I don't think there's a question in there. Representative Sundin.
Thank you. To the testifiers, I've got a pulp and paper mill in my district that's quite a bit different from some of the others, and they utilize baled pulp from other sources out of the state, and then the pulp mill actually produces cellulose fiber that's exported to China, the bulk of it. I'm just wondering, a lot of that pulp comes in from Wisconsin. You know, I'm just questioning the accuracy of your numbers. You know, we don't see the influence of the imported pulp and the imported wood coming in from Wisconsin. How does that affect your numbers? And short of starting a trade war with Wisconsin, can we utilize our resources here in Minnesota, pulp resources, better rather than importing from Wisconsin continually? And are there any policies that we're overlooking that could enhance utilization of our wood better than importing, rather than importing?
Director Ball.
Mr. Chair, Representative Sundin, overall, our state uses about 2.8, 2.9 million cords annually to get fiber to every single mill. It's a mill survey. So every mill in conglomerate uses about 2.8, 2.9 million cords. The state has been offering 800,000 cords, and we're going up to 870, and with our special initiative with 30,000 in Ash and Tamarack. The other 2 million cords or so comes from other landowners, including the private land, federal land, county land, and imports, and Wisconsin. So that's just a mix. That's what the machines that we have, that's what it requires. And those folks are going to, that run those mills are going to go get that fiber wherever they can. And we believe that the 870,000 cord number is the right number for Minnesota because it really balances all the interests and really provides that stable and increased level of harvest on DNR lands that over what we've done in the past.
Follow-up, Representative Sundin.
No, just a comment. I'm sure on that 870 number, I'm certain that the people in Wisconsin agree with you as well. So.
Right. Representative Lewick.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And to Mr. Bowe, my understanding is we've got about 280,000 acres or cords, actually acres of aspen. It's way over the 35, 40-year harvest, normal harvest rotation age. And given that literally once you reach that point, that standing timber devalues significantly to the point where it becomes even a problem, particularly for some of the mills that are very selective on the quality of aspen. How does what the agency decided to do compare with the recommendations that one, the contractor made, and two, what's Wisconsin and what's Canada doing? Do they have the same problem where they've got old aspen way beyond rotation? You can't get new aspen unless you cut old aspen.
Director Ball.
Mr. Chair, Representative Lewick, I'll answer your second question first. I don't know a lot about what aspen looks like in Canada and Wisconsin. I do know the prices are higher for overall timber in Wisconsin, so I think we're doing something right here. And I will talk about aspen in just a minute specifically. I think can address your question there.
I say that's obviously coming up, but obviously that fits in that overall harvest, and the component of aspen really can have a huge impact on individual mills depending on what they're looking at, and it maybe goes to Representative Sundin's comment about products coming in from across the state line, which is fine if we don't have any, but I want to make sure that we get ours to the mill first. Thank you.
All right, Director Bowe, I think we're ready for you to continue your presentation.
Okay. You know, along with our number, we did take a very hard look at whether 1 million cords of timber is sustainable. We had determined that it is not sustainable on DNR managed lands. The scenarios, a couple of the scenarios did show that 1.1 million cords was theoretically possible for 15 to 20 years before dropping to about 900,000 cords long term. But that theoretically, the model was based on several assumptions, and one is that it assumed that our inventory was 100% accurate, and we know that that's not the case. We've talked before the Finance Committee several times about inventory initiatives and how we need to get our inventory up to date. So when the model bases 1.1 million cords, assuming our inventory is accurate, we know that there's a little bit of a flaw there. The model also assumes that every acre is producing the maximum modeled volume. So it presumes that every acre is a really good acre of forest land. And it also presumes that there's no operational adjustments that are needed to reflect kind of the on-the-ground reality. So my example of that is we do have areas that are too steep, maybe, for logging. We have acres that are not accessible because they're landlocked, and private landowners won't allow us to get into those. Or even acres where maybe the temporary road cost to get into that stand would exceed the value of the timber. So we might put it up for sale, but it just never gets sold. So there's things that are based in the model. There's many assumptions, and again, we know that is not accurate. And our MB&G contractor suggested that you really do need to take a look at all of these other factors: the inventory, the operability, all of those things, in making your determination. The models that were developed are just those. They are put there to show you the differences, the trade-offs, and I'll talk about that more in a minute. But let's talk about aspen first. And this really boils down to our DNR inventory. And based on our inventory, the MB&G analysis showed that in all model scenarios, we have less aspen available in the future. And so our plan is to gradually reduce the amount of aspen for sale over the 10-year period, go from our current level of 400,000 cords of aspen, and in 10 years down toward 360,000 cords. And this is really needed to ensure that we have sustainability in the future. I think, failing to do some reduction now would cause greater risks and market disruptions later, and also risks to our biological resources. It's interesting that, we look at this 10-year picture, and that's what we're basing our decision on, but the model actually looked out 100 years. And if you look at 50 years down, and it broke it into 5-year periods, and even the most aggressive harvest scenario in 50 years showed that aspen would be down around 300,000 cords. So that's a significant decline. Again, at this harvest level, we are maintaining a very minimal amount of older aspen, to Representative Lewick's question, to meet our habitat and biodiversity needs, but we don't expect large amounts of acres kept in older aspen. This harvest level will liquidate the majority of that. We also know that it wasn't part of this analysis, but we also know that there's abundant aspen available on private and federal land, and that's according to our FIA data, the forest inventory analysis that's done by the U.S. Forest Service. And although it wasn't part of our analysis, it was a decision in how low to take our aspen resource. So there is older aspen on private lands. We believe that, kind of this thoughtful transition minimizes the impact to the industry. We certainly didn't want to come out right out of the chute and have a lower aspen number. So, kind of a thoughtful, gradual reduction, providing time for increased aspen harvest on some of those other ownerships, and then also increased use of our other tree species. The MB&G analysis really helped inform our decision and show the trade-offs. It was designed to inform and really not to determine. The model uses and tests different levers and talks about and shows long-term and short-term consequences in all of that. I think for the sake of time, I'm going to plow into some of the scenarios because this is terribly interesting, at least to me. And I know that in your handout this is going to be pretty tough to see, so hopefully you can pick up some of it on the screen. And the purpose is to really show the number of modeling scenarios that we completed. Basically, what this is showing is that there's a lot of levers that can be pulled on and turned off, and how each of these levers can affect our timber harvest level. And there's kind of four main categories. The first one was timber potential. The other category that was researched is non-timber potential. We looked at a yield analysis, and we also looked at school trust analysis. So again, this is all about the things that you turn on, you turn off, so that you can see the difference that those things make when it comes to the harvest level. So this, I'm going to go back here 1 second. So if you see all those small little numbers on the left-hand side, 1.1, 0.1, all the way down to 4.2.2, you catch those? So here's a graphic, and this is I pulled right out of the MB&G analysis. And so you can see these scenarios and you can see the trade-offs for all of those. So I just want to point out the wide range of timber volumes that are available based on what levers you kind of turn on and turn off. The highest levels, of course, don't represent all the values that we need to consider. And the lower levels are really harvest levels that prioritized wildlife habitat that needed older forests. So that's our range. So that harvest level of around 600,000 really put a priority to wildlife habitat and wildlife species that wanted older forest. And so again, this was really meant to show the trade-offs. The department did not choose any particular model, but taking all the factors and maybe pulling a lever a little way out or pushing a lever all the way in. So we didn't choose any particular model scenario. This next graphic, again, I'm sure in your handout it's a little bit tough to read, but I threw this one in there. We also had this in our report. You should have gotten that. And it's really a comparison of our market trends, our species, our DNR sales history, the MB&G analysis scenarios, and what we're proposing as a harvest level by tree species. So I'm just going to walk through one or two of these with you so that you can see how this works. So look at the ash species, the very first one. The market trend over the last 5 years it's been pretty flat, maybe increasing a little bit, but generally pretty flat. We don't sell a lot of ash. Our average cords offered for that 5-year period is just over 10,000 cords, and we've sold just over 9,000 cords. Now what's important between these two numbers, between offered and sold, is work. It takes a lot of work to offer cords. And if we do a lot of work and we don't sell the cords, then we have what's happening with our school trust lands right now, where we've put up a lot of wood, it's been sold, but it hasn't been harvested and the dollars haven't come in yet. So we want to make sure that we keep the work and the sold as close as we can, but always have a little bit of buffer so that people can continue to purchase. So continuing to go across in scenario 1.1.2, this was a scenario that really talked about the biological potential, and in this case, ash. And we talk about some restrictions. So some restrictions were really statutory restrictions. We protect rare and endangered species, and we follow the Minnesota Forest Resources guidelines, right? Those are our statutory restrictions. So with that, we could biologically, timber potential for ash is almost 61,000 cords annually. But you can see what our average sold has been and our average offered has been. If you look at a different scenario in our study, scenario 1.2.4.3, it prioritized non-timber values. In other words, it prioritized the biodiversity and old forest habitats, some of those things. And if you looked at that, we could offer 40,000 cords of ash. And yet another one, 2.2.2, when it talks about optimizing older forest habitats. So we took a look at all of those species. What do they have to offer? What's our current market? And as you can see, we're proposing that we really try to ramp up ash and go from 25 to 40 and even more than that with our ash initiative. So again, just thinking about the market a little bit and what's been our traditional offer. I'll show you another one. Go down to white cedar. We don't harvest a lot of white cedar in the state. These are generally our deer yards and other habitats. We less than 2,000 cords are offered, and at least at this point, we sell about 1,200 cords. Now, the biological potential is over 50,000 cords, but are we really going to put up a lot of white cedar? Our industry in Minnesota doesn't use white cedar, and so there's a lot of it out there, but again, with no use for it, it's kind of a use for crafts and those kinds of things, or special products like railings. We sell some of it, but not a big use by our major users. So that's how this graphic is working, and we're proposing to keep that flat in our offered range. All right, key considerations. Certainly the biological growth for potential and various tree species was a key consideration in our decision. And then of course the trade-offs. Those trade-offs were timber productivity, natural resource economies, biodiversity, water quality, wildlife habitat, and forest health. We certainly considered a lot of stakeholder input. We got a lot of advice from the Office of School Trust Lands, and our public comments advised us in this decision. And again, this is really about balancing all the forest values, and we believe the 870,000 cords offered does that and balances that well. There's a lot of work to be done. There's a transition. You transition all this information to actually implementation on the ground. So we're going to restart all of that right away. After that transition is completed, we'll restart our section SFR&P processes. This isn't a one and done kind of thing. We're constantly reassessing and looking. We think we need to kind of look at this in about 5 years and repeat the entire analysis again in 10 years. So it's not something that we just throw up there 870,000 cords and let ride. We're constantly reassessing and working with our industry partners, assessing our goals and our timber targets, and certainly need to do a full assessment of our ash and tamarack initiative see where that's landing in the next 5 years. So with that, Mr. Chair, I will, Luke and I will take questions.
All right, thank you, Director. Representative Lewick.
Thank you. Excellent report. They say there's a lot of analysis. I guess this is a general question, and I don't know if that was looked at. One of the things that I've noted over the years is if you take a look at previously farmed land, at least up in the northern part of the state, and watch what happens, you'll see sometimes where either private sector or with, and obviously with the help of the government, you'll see a pine plantation put in, and then you'll see a little chunk of land that, for whatever reason, they decided to keep that open so they could probably had a fair shot at the deer. And then they quit cutting the hay on it, and the next thing you know, you got an aspen forest right beside it. I know we've got a huge amount of plantation, replanted type pine stuff. How much impact, and do you look at that? I mean, we intentionally shift forest, management based on what highest value typically we can get off that land. But I see that dichotomy on where we intentionally will push pine in, and this is just watching what the private sector does, and this is not foresters, this is the average citizen. They got a nice pine plantation, and they leave another piece of it alone, and next thing you know, in comes private logger, and some of these in my lifetime are on their second rotation already. So what's going on in our world where we make a much broader decision on how we will come back after we've done a harvest, particularly in shifting it from aspen to pine?
Bo.
Mr. Chair, Representative Lewick, there's a lot more money in pine. And I'm, for the state, we take a look at, what does the land really want to grow? That would be one of the things that we would look like, or look at. And if it's not a little bit sandier soil, if it's pine won't grow there. And in a lot of cases, the private landowners are making just maybe different decisions. But we're certainly looking at what wants to grow there, what will do best, and how will the state and the industry be served well with the species that would be on the ground.
All right, Representative Eklund.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Director, for the report. A couple of questions here that tweaked my interest. You mentioned, first off, private forest management and the amount of aspen available, and we'll be frank here, aspen is the key species that we're talking about for our forest products industry at this time. So first off, on the private forest management, how is that program going, and when will we have some decent numbers on how much wood is coming off the private forest?
Director Bo.
Mr. Chair, Representative Eklund, thanks for the question, and I think the program is going good. As you know, we just got it up and running 2 years ago. Last year was our first year to offer some cost share dollars to landowners, and I do have an accomplishment report. I'd be happy to share that with you, but I'll just grab a few numbers off of here. We've done 633 stewardship plans in the last number of months. And the stewardship plan is really the first step in getting a landowner to think about their forest and have a plan for it. So that plan could include harvest. It also includes maybe some things that they would want to do to repair their forest roads, reforest an old field, all of those kinds of things. So all of those items are in there. We have also cost shared 800,000 trees, seedlings to be planted on this private land. So there's things that are happening. That takes a lot of cups of coffee around a table of a private landowner to first of all get them to think that, yeah, we should do a plan, and then, oh, do you want to plant trees? Oh, what about a harvest? All of those things. It definitely takes time. We've started to track a lot of different metrics, and I know one of the main ones, of course, is what kind of timber harvest are we getting out of this initiative? We have 864 referrals to consultants that we've given. Now, we don't do all of the harvest plans for the private landowners. We've tried to let the private forest consultants do that work. That's how they make their money. And if we start to get into their business too deep, they push back on us quite a bit. So we've made 864 referrals for a timber sale to a consultant. Every once in a while, and maybe more than every once in a while, a landowner says, no, I just want you to do it. I really want the DNR to do it. We've done 61 timber sales that account for over 15,000 cords of timber coming in so far. So it's a start. Normally, a consultant will only want to do kind of the bigger timber sales, again, because that's where they make their money. If they do a small timber sale, it may not be worth it for them, but that's where the DNR will step in and help them with it.
Representative Eklund?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So that sounds like some progress, and I'd like to continue seeing the reports on that. And then you mentioned the amount of aspen on the National Forest that's out there. How is the partnership with the National Forest going, and are we going to see some increase? Because the company I used to work for used to say that whatever they got for the National Forest, they just counted as a bonus.
Director Bowe.
Mr. Chair, Representative Eklund, as you know, we have entered into good neighbor authority agreements with both the Chippewa and Superior. We started out with some pilot projects of just a few acres the first couple of years, but really ramping up. As a matter of fact, in the Superior, I think we're going to try to do 10,000 acres with them over the next year, and those acres then turn into cords. So if you think about 10,000 acres at 20 acres or 20 cords per acre, that's a bunch of cords that will be able to help out with getting that wood to market. Again, over a period of years, but continuing to ramp up to that level.
All right. Representative Eklund.
Real quick here, Mr. Chair, thank you. You mentioned, Director, you mentioned about on the one chart about the timber sales and sold versus harvest, and you might, there's not the money coming in. How long is the contracts? When the DNR sells at auction, how long is does the logging company have the contract to make that harvest?
Director Bowe.
Mr. Chair, Representative Eklund, normally our sales are for 3 years, and that's good for loggers because they need to have at least 3 years worth so they can kind of maneuver through their portfolio of wood, especially as some of these winters that aren't too conducive to frozen conditions. They need opportunities, and so our permits are generally for 3 years. We do offer one free extension for things that just come up for the logger, and then periodically we've offered a free extension when we have what we call adverse surface conditions. In other words, it's just such a poor winter for logging that we just give everyone an extension.
Representative Eklund.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and the last one for right now anyway. So you talked about, Director, you talked about the 5-year assessment. So I know as a former county commissioner, when we managed timber sales on the auctions for the county, sometimes what the foresters came in for a number, the actual harvest was higher, just because it's you say we use the 20 cords per acre, but it could be 22 or 23 depending on conditions. So is that going to be part, when you take that data, is that going to be part of the assessment to find out whether we can actually adjust this timber harvest higher at the 5-year mark? Because from what we're hearing from the companies there, this 870,000 cords is going to put some of those companies in potential financial risk.
Director Bowe.
Mr. Chair, Representative Eklund, 870,000 cords is our target to be offered. In the past, our target was 800, but you also saw that you know, our 5-year average was 836 or whatever that number was. So we have a target, and you're right. Sometimes those timber sales come in a little bit better than you know, right at 20 cords per acre or
And sometimes worse.
and
Yeah.
sometimes worse. So it's an average. Again, the 870,000 cord number over the 10 years is, you know, is a number that we're very comfortable with. We think it does provide that balance. But we do understand that as things come forward, it does go up or down a little bit over the years. But as an average, we're generally meeting our goal, if not exceeding.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Mr. Bowe, I was caught by your comments about the small managed plantations and the assistance provided in the stewardship plans and that sort of thing. My personal experience is that over the 40 years, it seems like it's changed, that about 30, 40 years ago, that the DNR was a main player in supporting those small plantations, and that then that shifted more towards private consultants. And a couple of things. One, I think I read where there's kind of an uptick in DNR employees being involved with that. And then I guess my question is, are you thinking, do you see links between that and what I would think is a surprisingly small harvest off the small plantations?
Director Bowe.
Mr. Chair, Representative Johnson, there has been a shift, and you know, I can attest that you know, in the 90s we had 43 FTEs working in our private forest management section, helping landowners throughout the state. Through budget reductions into the 2000s, I think before we got our new initiative, we had 4. And the new initiative that was passed just a couple of years ago allowed us to put about 13 or 14 more individuals back in the field, and that's helped a great deal. So at least now the private landowners have somebody to call. They've got somebody to visit with about what to do, and you know, we're helping them as best we can. And again, for some of those bigger projects, we try to funnel a lot of that work to the private consultants.
Follow-up, Mr.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll take the liberty of making a comment. I would encourage that. I really, and again, it's based on personal experience. I think you know the situation with my dad, but it wasn't only him, it was the neighbors that really benefited from the work of the local office in Nimrod, and really, I think, really fueled an understanding and taught us how to be tree farmers. And the access to the DNR, one was a confidence level I think my family operation had with the DNR, but also just the easy access. You have it, they're there, and the service was tremendous. And so I would encourage you to keep moving in that direction, because I think part of the issue here, it is interesting that we're having a smaller harvest off the small managed lands, and that can create problems, Representative Lewick, if those aren't being harvested. There's a number of problems. So I would encourage you to come forward next year. I won't be here to help you, but with another ask, and keep beefing up that staffing.
All right. Director Bowe and Director Skinner, I want you guys to stay close. Could we have President Brandt and Director Stish come on down together? Thank you for your presentation.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, thank you very much. Wayne Brandt, Executive Vice President. President's the chair of the board. You know, I don't want to be usurping the ones that supervise me's role or title. So, Minnesota Forest Industries and Minnesota Timber Producers Association. I do have with me today Ashley Leonard, who's our Director of Forest Policy for Minnesota Forest Industries. She is one of those forest biometricians that Forrest Bowe was talking about, one of those smart people that do these kind of computer modeling exercises. So we're pleased to have her on our staff. She's got a bachelor's and a master's from Michigan Tech. We would have preferred U of M, but we had to go with Michigan Tech. My remarks are directed at the department, not at the Division of Forestry. I want to be very clear about that today.
The department characterizes their 870,000 cord recommendation as an increase. Seems to me the arithmetic says that they were selling 800. They increased for last fiscal year and this fiscal year to 900, and now they're going to 870. That sounds like a decrease to us in the marketplace. I want to be very clear about that. Just echo in terms of the analysis what Director Bowe said. The analysis was conducted on half of the forest land, does not include the non-commercial or reserved acres. The recommendation from the department would be determinative for the next 10-year planning cycle. It's not determinative for 100 years. I don't know that any of us can make a decision for 100 years. I come here today in the context that ours is an industry that continues to have very significant economic challenges. In Representative Lehman's district, earlier this year, late last year, UPM Blandin Paper shut down another paper machine. It's a tough business out there. And every manufacturing facility, every machine is on a cost curve. They're well known, and those that have high costs, whether it's timber, whether it's energy or other inputs, they're the ones that go by the wayside. Others continue to be challenged also. One of our building products manufacturers cited the other day that of the 13 mills that his company owns in North America, I think 5 in Canada and 8 in the U.S., they have the second highest wood costs at that facility of the 13 mill fleet for that company. And the company is in the process of likely shutting down the mill permanently that has the highest wood costs. So there's high stakes for us in the industry. I did provide a couple of handouts. One has got the letterhead and some graph on the back that shows DNR offer and total offer, new offer, and sold volumes for the past 10 years. If you look back, you'll see there's some higher bars in there and then some moderating and then going up. There are also a number of points on that handout that I won't go through. Same graph on the front as Director Bowe showed you in terms of the modeled runs. The only one that was not on his graph is the red one that starts out the highest. That's the run that we did with similar constraints to some of the ones that Mason, Bruce, and Gerard did that we ran in our office. So the numbers certainly were not surprising to us, which clearly in our view show that you can harvest well in excess of 1 million cords a year for the next 15 or 20 years. And when you look at, if you care to look at the second graph in the packet, which gets a little bit busy, but it projects out 10 years and 40 years the aspen cover type on DNR timberlands, so those lands that the analysis was done on. The blue bar on the left is the current age class for each of those different age increments. The gold bar in the middle is model run 1.1.2, one of those that's up there in the 1.1 million range. And then the purple is 1.2.4.3, which is one of the lowest ones, if not the lowest one. The point here, if you look at 10 years projected out and 40 years projected out, is that you will still have a substantial amount at the higher harvest level of older aspen. If you project it out 10 years, you still got a couple 100,000 cords or a couple 100,000 acres in those older classes. And in fact, if you project it out 40 years, one rotation, you still have something on the order of 140,000 acres. So the higher levels aren't going to decimate the aspen that's out there. In our view, going from 1.1 down to 870 has to have involved many reductions on the part of the department as the leadership of the department sorted through the views of the 3 primary divisions that were involved in this study. On a technical basis, and I won't belabor this, but we feel that the growth in yield equations that were used in the model runs were not appropriately or effectively used, and they are quite conservative. University of Minnesota is in the process of updating those growth and yield equations, and we would urge the department to utilize those when they begin their planning process. And if they show higher numbers, well, let's use the higher numbers. If they show lower numbers, well, I guess we got to use the lower numbers, because the numbers are what the numbers are when you use those. Amongst the things that we've found in terms of the model runs and what we think the department arrived at in coming down to their 870 number, one of the things that the modelers were instructed to do was, as a surrogate for climate change, to project out over the different time horizons, converting about 0.5% of the aspen acres per year to other cover types. Now, in these modeling exercises, it's information and it shows you the trade-offs of what you're projecting out. We think that the department, instead of incorporating that reduction, which is about 20,000 cords of aspen a year, in there going from 1.1 to 870, that they rather ought to be monitoring and seeing whether or not we're actually seeing those conversions on the ground happening, but not utilizing that projection to lower the harvest. The report, and I would commend the report, particularly the appendix that has the memorandum from the Office of Permanent School Trust Fund Lands. They endorse the higher harvest level, higher harvest scenarios for the management of their lands. It's not clear to us in going from 1.1 to 870 how the department handled that. So, we've got a number of questions that we'll be meeting with them about. Another area that involved significant reductions was the department's approach to wildlife management areas and how they're going to manage those areas. The department's report actually included the statutory direction for WMA management, and it says, state wildlife management areas shall be established to protect those lands and waters which have a high potential for wildlife production, and to develop and manage these lands and water for the production of wildlife, for public hunting, fishing and trapping, and for other compatible outdoor recreational uses. We think that gives a direction towards the public hunting, trapping in this instance. And the species that are most hunted in this state are clearly deer and grouse, and those are clearly benefited by younger forest habitats. I think everybody knows that. We're not talking about going in and we don't dispute the need for thermal cover, but aspen and hardwood don't provide any thermal cover. You're talking cedar and some of the spruce swamps and such on those lands that are going to provide thermal cover. The approach versus a more traditional approach on WMAs costs about 45,000 cords a year, based on the analysis. So we think that needs to be looked at again. And if there's a habitat issue out there, it's not old forest habitats in our state or in fact in the eastern half of the United States, it's young forest habitats. Those are the habitats that are most challenged out there. And we think that needs to be given some consideration. Representative Lewick asked a question about the backlog of aspen acres. Currently, there's about 280,000 acres, I got the same number as you do, that are over the rotation age. If you simply, and this isn't biometrics math, this is Wilmer High School math, if you take the 280,000 acres times the statewide average of 20 cords to the acre, that's 5.6 million cords. You divide that by 10 years of the next planning horizon, that's 560,000 cords of aspen a year. The DNR's number is 360. That's a big difference. That's a 200,000 cord difference. Now, we're not saying that every acre of the 280,000 backlog makes a commercial timber sale, but 280,000 acres, 200,000 cords a year is a large difference, and we intend to get to the bottom of that, and then would encourage you to encourage the department to do the same. One of the things that we had strongly urged the department to have the consultant do in the study, that was not done, is to put the projected changes in habitats, so cover type, age class distributions, into context of the entire forested land base here in the state. We have the technology to do that. It's, maybe it was beyond the scope, maybe it was beyond the budget, but $500,000 seemed like a lot of money to us to do this project. So what we wanted them to do, and what we think is important, is take a look. So if you have a generally younger distribution of age class on cover types on state lands, what does that do to the habitats within that landscape, given that you have private lands, county lands, and federals? Is it a significant change? Is it apt to be a detriment to different wildlife species? That was not done. We think that should have been done, and we think that should be done at some point. If you look at the last 3 graphs in this package, the color one, that shows aspen stumpage prices by public ownership. So DNR is the red line, or is the green line, counties are the red line, and the feds are the blue line. Stumpage prices on aspen continue to go up. These aren't sustainable. Last time it happened was 10 years ago. We lost a third of this industry. And we've just lost another machine at Blandon, and frankly, the Duluth mill is in the process of hopefully successfully converting from the printing and writing papers that they make, super calendared now, to the only growth area in the industry, which is brown paper. I never really saw the day that we would be looking at brown paper as a savior, but our economy has changed. The Amazon economy, that's the growth area. So in order for them to continue to operate that mill, they got to get in a different product line.
Mr. Brandt,
Yep.
just, if you could for the committee, maybe put a little price comparison to 10 years ago, kind of where that was at, and energy costs and the rest, when you saw that large drawback in the industry compared to where we are potentially, according to that graph, going today.
Sure. If you go back, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, a couple of years before that, you would have seen the aspen number up in the 40 to 60 range. We at that time had the highest hardwood pulp prices in the world. The companies that closed the 4 engineered wood products facilities continued to make those products. They made them elsewhere. And this was at a time of going into the recession and with the housing market crash. So the higher cost facilities got shut down, and they were permanent shutdowns. So we've seen some moderation then for a period of time as demand dropped very significantly, but now we're back in this inflationary period, and these stumpage prices are not sustainable, for the mills that operate here. Similarly, if you look at the next 2 graphs, you'll see, and this is combining all of the ownerships on black spruce, and then the final one on red pine for our sawmills. So as we look at it, and maybe just one little bit more of context, there's big numbers that we're talking about here, but at the statewide average of 20 cords to the acre, a 100,000 cord increment is 5,000 acres. 5,000 acres is 0.029% of the forest land in this state, and it's 0.09% of the DNR administered forest land. What we did not hear from the department, and haven't heard yet, and maybe we will at some point, is how they arrived at their trade-offs and going from 1.1 to 870. They've not articulated the harm that would potentially occur at the 1.1 million cord level, or a million cords. And we've heard a lot of generalities, but we have a lot of specifics relative to what's happening in the marketplace for our companies and for the rural economy of our state. So we appreciate the department doing this. It's the kind of exercise that they should do every 10 years as they go into their planning process. But we have some pretty significant questions about how it ended up at 870. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Brandt. Stish?
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, my name is Deanne Stish. I am new as the Executive Director of the Minnesota Forest Resource Council. I've worked with this committee in a variety of roles in the past related to our forests in Minnesota, and I'm honored here today to be here with you to talk about just the existence of the council and as it relates to the peripheral issue of the STHA. In my past role, I've worked with both federal, state, county, tribal, and private landowners, and bringing those interests together seems very appropriate and timely as we develop some practical application-based research, promote collaboration, and develop cross-ownership projects that we can learn and benefit from. As you all are familiar with the state's Sustainable Forest Resources Act, I've placed that in your material along with the outline of the work that the council does. The unique aspect of the SFRA's Chapter 89 is that it created a council that focused not just exclusively on DNR lands, and I think that was in of itself a visionary approach that our state's values cross boundaries. The council administers the national model for this all-lands approach. We develop innovative voluntary site-level guidelines that I'm sure you're all familiar with. Many of you probably have these books in your offices. If you don't, we have many that we can share with you. This is just the pocket guide. Recently, this is the standard for on the ground for forest management practices, and it's a national model. It just recently went through a forest management review process, assessing and monitoring its application. If you look at it from, say, the legislative perspective, it's like having Jim Nobles come out and look at your activity on the ground and giving you a report card back. So it's very thorough, and it is a very important tool so that we are balancing all of the different values that the SFRA calls on as water quality, wildlife, and various values like that. We also develop a landscape level program across Minnesota's unique 6 landscape areas. Many of the conversations that you're hearing talking about lands projects and activities are discussed in these 6 landscape regional committees. Thousands of man hours go into developing projects and activities that can benefit those regions that have specific issues facing them. As you've heard today, the STHA is a look at a very small part of our state lands, and I think we've talked specifically about how, you know, this analysis predicated its notion on the fact that our inventory is 100% accurate. I don't think anyone here would suggest that's the case, but that is a focus that the council is going to be taking a look at, is how we better integrate more accurate data and look at other lands in their inventory through the Forest Service's Forest Inventory and Analysis to give us a better picture on these very diverse landscapes as to the very balancing of these values. A significant goal for action on our state lands requires broad support, and as I indicated, our landscape programs tackle these unique and critical issues on a local level, and they develop ideas and proactive ideas that they can bring to the table that the council can chew on and decide if they're helpful, bring those ideas to the committee here, as well as to our governor. If we recall back in November, the governor's directive was to undertake this assessment, but in reading that full letter, there were several other aspects to his directive, which was looking at all ownership possibilities and potential for increased fiber. That is a unique role the council can play in fostering and facilitating. Also looking at using other authorities that exist that can enhance more fiber, more management. When I speak with our national forest supervisors, they talk about the backlog of work that needs to be done, the fiber that can be produced from those types of projects through Good Neighbor Authority and other opportunities is another role that the council can play effectively. Ongoing coordination is vital to managing all of our lands. The council's broad representation is uniquely situated to provide that feedback from all of our different groups, from wildlife, academia, industry, our public land managers, and our tribal interests. We appreciate the committee taking the time to hear more about the council's work. I'd be happy to provide any additional information, and the council would love to come before the committee at another date, talk about our research program. Today, interestingly, our Research Advisory Committee is reconvening over at the U to talk about opportunities for our needs assessment that can assist us going forward on real, timely, on-the-ground application of research that gets to the point of some of the climate adaptive approaches, seasonality, soil operability, So assisting us and knowing more helps us manage our lands better. So just a brief overview is we're sort of a council that we want to make sure we're more present for you all as policymakers. So I appreciate the time today, Mr. Chairman, and look forward to seeing you again.
Well, thank you very much. Any questions for our testifiers? Representative Luke.
Thank you, and I guess one of the things I didn't hear anything about, something we've been working on and within the industry for decades, and that is safety issues relative to the logging industry. And I know, both of your organizations have got both feet in the middle of that, and if you could just quickly talk about what we're doing for those that don't understand or know where the basis of the question is. One of the most potentially dangerous professions out there is logging, even with the huge modern machinery, and so that safety program is critical within the industry. It's right up there with farming. I mean, you can't get insurance.
Mr. Brent.
Sure. Thank you very much for the question, Representative Lewick. We, as Minnesota Timber Producers Association, write about 95% of the logging work comp that's written in the state through our program currently with Bitco Insurance. This is one of the big success stories through the years. If you go back to 1989, 1990, when I started in this industry, our work comp rates were $60 for every $100 of payroll, and we had people doing everything they could to legally or marginally get payroll out of the system. Today, those rates have been as low as $6 or $7. They're up around $9 now. We've been able to drive the injury rate down, and we've particularly been able to drive down with attention to safety, the traumatic injuries, crushing, trees hitting people, things of that nature. What we see in our program, which is the bulk of the marketplace for work comp claims now, are backs from sitting in the chairs in the equipment, carpal tunnel from running the joysticks, those kinds of things. And and the one that's really frustrating, and those are ergonomic issues, which we continue to work with the manufacturers on, but the one that's really frustrating to me is the other category of injuries that we also continue to see are slips and falls getting on and off the machinery. I'm sure you see that in the farm country too, and it's just, man, you just harp on people, and then they don't have a 3-point contact, and pretty soon they're on the ground, they've snapped an ankle. But we've made significant progress, and it's safety's job one every day in the woods. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much. If you want to just back away from the table, we do have a couple folks. Mr. Arnosti, if you'd come to the table and introduce yourself. If there's someone else from the public that would like to testify, please make your way up to the table so that you can quickly. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to testify. My name is Don Arnosti. I'm the Conservation Director for the Isaac Walton League, and I did serve on the advisory committee to this study process, as I have for probably a couple dozen forestry studies over the last 30 years. And I have to say that I'm very impressed with what was done. This was the next generation of models, and what was particularly valuable is they did more than a single run. What I'd like to emphasize is that the Isaac Walton League supports timber harvesting. We recognize it as important to the economy, important to management of our lands for wildlife and biodiversity. And our state president is a retired DNR forester. So this is not about not supporting the industry. We do. What we agree on is it's a good idea to do this study and to repeat it every 10 years. I think some really valuable information was brought forward by the fact that we did more than 20 different alternatives to look at the range of options. What I would mention is what Mr. Brandt is emphasizing is the option that I absolutely supported that we run, which is, I'm going to call it the timber maximum option. And the opposite end of that scale is one that was taking a look at maximizing wildlife habitat, biodiversity, and species for the future. That one showed a sustainable harvest range of 570 to 600,000 cords per year. So what we're really talking about here is somewhere between 600,000 cords a year, which would optimize wildlife habitat, older forests, species that are going to be there as we face climate change, versus maximizing production in the near term. The 1.1 million cords is turning our forests or pushing them to produce like we push our farmlands. And I think we all know our forests produce many different products. So what I would say, what I want to leave you with, because I know you're short on time, and thank you for the opportunity to testify, is the DNR's target of 870,000 cords a year plus 30,000 in the short term, I would say is aggressive. And that I believe 800,000 cords would be a better balanced figure between the 900,000 cords a year that the study showed is the long-term sustainable at the timber side of things process versus the 600,000, which is what the biodiversity and wildlife optimization scenario showed. Part of the reason why I say 870 to 900,000 cords a year is aggressive has to do with the fact that the winters that we are not having lately means that much of this timber and many of these species are very much in question, as there really will be there, and whether the industry will get to them. I thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I'll be sure to come around and visit with many of you individually.
Thank you. Any questions? Any other comments from the crowd? All right, just with a final comment, I appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation. I think I think there is questions on the amount when it comes to this timber harvest and what the potential next 10 years are going to hold. And with it, I would just ask the department to be as responsive as possible to the industry and to those partners when it comes to job viability, industry viability, and the rest. We can say we may have bright futures ahead, but we may have dark ones as well. And I hope that the department and the industry can work together to come to some common ground and with the public and keeping all those other things in check as well. But with that, we are adjourned.